it's not like the bond vigilantes were in charge. It was just they were doing what they normally do. They were thinking, okay, Liz Truss doesn't know what she's doing. There's going to be inflation. Interest rates are going to go up. We'll bid accordingly.
They were trying to second guess what the Bank of England was going to think. Will the Bank of England find this inflationary and therefore raise the rate? Yeah, it's all very circular.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. Just wanted to jump in here to tell you that Modern Money Lab are running a series of free online lectures throughout January and February featuring John T. Harvey, Yeva Nassisian, Ndongo Sambasila, Daniel Koza, and Fred Block. I'm sure long-time listeners will be familiar with most of those names and won't want to miss out, so there's a link in the show notes to where you can get registered for those lectures, along with links to some other things that you might find helpful for following the conversation in this particular episode. What follows is part 1 of a 2-part conversation, but the whole conversation is available now on our Patreon feed. You can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast for as little as $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And supporting the show in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are delighted to be joined today by our friend, economist and author of Can Heterodox Economics Make a Difference, Dr Phil Armstrong. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Christian, Patricia. Great to see you, be with you again.
So, down to business. This is the inaugural year of the Fauxbel Prize in economic commentary, which is awarded to the fakest of all the fake talking points that we've all been suffering through over the last 12 months. And I just want to say that fittingly, the Fauxbel Prize is in no way a real Nobel Prize, just like all the best prizes in economics. And I'm going to kick us off with a strong contender for the worst analogy of the year. Number 1, it's the fiscal black hole. The fiscal black hole is either ignored or rediscovered by chancellors depending on who's asking for money. And the way you navigate Spaceship Britannia if you're a Labour chancellor is by understanding that greedy, freezing pensioners and hungry children steer us towards the fiscal black hole, but fortunately buying houses for the Ministry of Defence steers us away from the fiscal black hole. Either way, it's out there and the UK government's always teetering on its event horizon. Phil, how worried should we be about the fiscal black hole?
Well, in terms of it in of itself, not at all. I mean, I'd be much more worried about black holes generally a long way away in the galaxy or even outside the galaxy. At least in theory, at some, our great-great-grandchildren times 1,000, the black hole might get here and do something. So I'm probably not something to worry about, tomorrow when you're doing your shopping. Whereas the fiscal black hole that, Rachel Reeves gone about, there's no chance we should ever worry about that. Apart from the fact, of course, if you have chancellors who have no understanding of the monetary system, their imaginary black hole might make them do, really unpleasant things, like take away, because I'm a state pensioner now, Christian, Patricia. I know that's hard to believe, but
that is hard to believe, yeah.
Thank you. And they took away my help with my fuel bills, and I was most upset about that. And, let's assume that they didn't need, they were short of money, even though they can press the money into the screen. Why take it off me? Why not take it off, I don't know, Alan Sugar or somebody? But we'll leave that for another thing. So we don't really need to worry about it. It's an imaginary problem. What I think is quite interesting on it about the black hole is that, let's say it was a problem. It's pretty miserable, isn't it? Just to come in, like Rachel Reeves did, and say to everybody, look, oh, we're all in trouble. We're going down. We've got years of pain. But don't worry, maybe, just maybe, the economy will grow and then the black hole will go with it and we'll all go okay. But for now, it's pain all the way. But don't worry, we're going to get growth. Well, I mean, if you're like a new head teacher, do you imagine taking over a school and you take over and go, now look, you got all the kids and all the staff. It's been really bad under the last headmaster. So really, we're really in trouble for the next 3 years and nothing anyone can do about it. Everybody just goes, well, aren't you supposed to, fix things and that? So on the pure, it's so negative. So it's an imaginary problem made out to be important by very miserable people. And the problem is, I just saw the growth data, and it was 0. So, oh dear. So anyway, sorry for the listeners. Happy New Year.
Patricia, you got any thoughts on this?
Well, if we're looking at this in terms of who's going to get the prize for the worst one, I would give it extra points for having a really kind of strong visual there. It's a very powerful, evocative visual that makes me think of doom and the end of the world. So, extra points for that. Other than that, I agree with Phil entirely.
I think what can cut through it all and shine a little light into the black hole is this is reality, which is the government only ever spends one way, and that's the answer to a lot of misinformation out there, and that way is by changing numbers on a spreadsheet. It's got nothing to do with an amount of substance hived away in some vault somewhere. The capacity to do that is not going to be diminished. What would be a rational argument against some particular category of spending would be there's a risk of inflation. The money can always be made available, but is it going to cause inflation? And then there's the secondary discussion about, well, is that inflation something that can be managed? Is it something that could be actually borne a little bit for a short period of time because the spending is still necessary? Or is it something that the government could manage with taxation, for instance? But in a way, that brings us to talking point number 2. Number 2 is the evergreen idea that government spending is, quote unquote, taxpayer funded. And it's the idea that the government gets its spending money from the private sector. Therefore, if we're heading towards a fiscal black hole, government needs to impose higher taxes on you and me and the rest of the private sector to fund our public services or to cut those public services. So, Patricia, what would you say to someone who had the idea that the government spending is revenue constrained?
Well, obviously, they're wrong. And I think, did you want to discuss the fiscal responsibility aspect? Because this phrase gets thrown in a lot with it. Is that it's kind of the opposite of what it means, of what they actually want to say. Because fiscal responsibility is about using the fiscal capacities of the government to deliver certain real outcomes in the economy and to make sure that, everybody has housing, everybody has access to food, everybody's employed, everybody has a minimum standard of living, and there isn't too much inequality in order to kind of tilt the balance of power within the economy towards any particular group. So, that's the things that are important. But our politicians have made fiscal responsibility all about balancing the budget, and this idea that, well, the government economics of government are just the same as the economics of a household, and therefore policy first and foremost has to be assessed on whether fiscal balances, the fiscal balance is the deficit is as small as possible, because deficits are long-term non-sustainable in the same way that deficits are long-term non-sustainable for a household. And that's completely wrong. And it's actually quite damaging, because the government, unlike a household, is the currency issuer. and therefore it has to behave completely different to a household. And the concept of responsibility, fiscal responsibility, is completely different to what it might be, responsibility of spending for a household. So that I really hate that, because it kind of embeds that phrase fiscal responsibility when it's used as a pro kind of austerity messaging, because it is very good at managing to kind of turn a concept on its head and actually frame really irresponsible behavior as responsible. And I think we need to reclaim that.
For you and me, spending less than we take in, we build up savings that might see us through for a rainy day. Why is it different for the government?
Well, I mean, we this is kind of going right to the beginning, isn't it? When, if you remember, when as two fresh-faced youngsters, you were starting out the MMT podcast. Not, I mean, you're still fresh-faced youngsters compared to me, of course. But I mean, we constantly get this issue where, in a crisis like COVID or financial crisis, governments kind of have to do or acknowledge they're doing something which is against the, we're all running out of money, where we're going to get it from, because they need to do it. And then when they do it, things get better. But bizarrely, as soon as they get better, they go back to their old ways. And it's really kind of strange. It's like something obviously works in a crisis. Well, why not keep it going? So it's like there's this crazy idea that the government is like a house. So like Patricia said, that governments have to get money from somewhere before they can spend. And it's so hard you can wobble it. It's like a tower. It gets wobbled, doesn't it? Like in COVID, remember when Rishi was popular? I think back, when he was giving us all money, and we didn't mention black holes. He just did it because he had to do it. The government would crash. And then we realised that the government was actually currency issuing. You didn't kind of have to borrow from the Saudi Arabians or anything. But now we've gone back, and it's almost as if when we've gone back in time and pretended the government needs to get money from taxpayers or borrowing, it's become ever more entrenched in people's minds. So that remains kind of the number one thing that we have to do, is bust that analogy.
What I find really funny is that the current government is following a line that was actually, the raising taxes, all that was quite similar to what the Conservatives were doing it. But now the Labour is doing it. I see people on radio and then commenting on this is turning into a Marxist state, simply because it's Labour government doing it, even though it's exactly the same policies that we were having. But what is true is that, under this idea of a black hole and this, need to balance the deficit, and more so, this balancing of the deficit has to begin with first raising the money before you can undertake government spending or whatever. Within the context of the UK, where, we've suffered, 15 years of austerity, however long it's been now, people are not feeling wealthy. And now you're raising taxes yet again, and it does feel. I heard somebody on the radio say the other day, I feel I'm paying more and more taxes and getting less and less in return, which I think is absolutely right.
I should also just emphasize what you were talking about just then, Phil. You were talking about the COVID relief packages, and that's discretionary spending, emergency policy put in place in a time of crisis. But the deficit expands automatically because we have these things called automatic stabilizers. So when there's a downturn or there's a shock like the COVID crisis, or it could be any, an environmental crisis could bring it about, people aren't paying as much tax. The private sector as a whole is not paying as much tax. And also the government is now paying more in benefits and transfers, and therefore the deficit is going up automatically. So if you cut away at government spending at a time of crisis, these automatic stabilizers kick in and actually expand the deficit anyway. So it's very, very counterproductive. And on that tip, Argentinian President Javier Milei comes in with his chainsaw to cut government. Phil, what's your read on that situation? Because the idea seems to have caught the eye of President-elect Elon Musk.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think it was Randy Ray. He's great with graphs. You know, he showed a graph of like across the 20th century and the beginning of this new century. You know, government spending and revenue from taxes. And it's quite interesting that the biggest things that move most, if you like, is tax revenue. So when you hit a crisis like the COVID crisis, the tax revenue crashes. So you get a bigger deficit. And that's good, as we all know, because it's actually supporting, you know, the automatic stabilizers are actually doing what they're supposed to do. Because the taxes have crashed, the government has to maintain its spending in a crisis. There'll be a bigger deficit. The deficit's just a residual. It's just a number that you get at the end. It doesn't matter in of itself. So, you know, if you've got very high unemployment and no inflation, which is delivered by excess spending, obviously it's more complicated because you can get inflation from other sources, which will leave for a moment, just park that idea. But if you've got no excess demand generated inflation and you've got heavy unemployment, it doesn't matter how big the deficit is. It needs to be bigger, not smaller. So it's not a legitimate target. That's the point, that you've got to kind of say, okay, the automatic stabilizer doing what they're doing, there will be a big deficit in a recession. And that's a good thing, because if it wasn't, we wouldn't get out of the recession. So it's the medicine, or if you like, the visual impact that the meds, that it's working, and these things are great. And that's why we haven't had Great Depression since the 30s. So it's the idea of making a budgetary outcome, which is just something on a spreadsheet, into a target. So that's the first real issue, that the government somehow is, with this whole OBR and all this nonsense, of trying to target budget outcomes for the government are not targets. They're just what happens at the end. And if you've got full employment and no inflation, then we could say, well done, whatever the deficit is. If you've got rampant inflation for too much spending, you might say, whoops, maybe your deficit's too big. And if, on the other hand, your unemployment, heavy unemployment, so your deficit's too small, irrespective of how big the deficit is or what it is as a percentage. And like your second question, you've got these right-wing ideologues, and they hate government per se, well, apparently, and they just want the government to be smaller because they don't like it. Unless, of course, they're part of it, but that's quite an irony, isn't it? That Elon Musk doesn't like the government, and now he's in it. In fact, humorously, apparently, he's now the boss of America.
Yeah. And he likes tariffs when it comes to Trump, but he likes no tariffs when it comes to Milei in Argentina as well. So he's adopting quite contrarian quite contrarian positions here.
You know that thing that Bill and Thomas Fazio, right, reclaiming the state? The basic idea there was that big business and these guys say they hate the government and want a little of it. But in reality, that's not what they really want. They just want the government to act in their interest.
Yeah.
Mm.
So they then mix the two up, because one thing was really funny and it really made me laugh. All these Bitcoin guys, you know, they all hate the government and the government's watching your every move. And, you know, I want to be able to buy AK-47s and I don't want anyone to know about it, you know, and whatever. They're all telling Trump to buy a Bitcoin reserve. But surely the government is a bad and malevolent force. Why would you want the government involved in buying your stuff? You want to get rid of the government. So, what you're really saying is, well, we don't like the government, we don't get rid of it. But it's really handy because it'll help us out. So when you look a bit deeper Now, I'm not saying all of these guys. Some of them really are like, let's go live in the woods in some state in America and just keep the government well at hand, and they don't want anything but gold nuggets, or if they've got a computer, Bitcoin. There are people like that, but they're in the minority. And like you say, Javier Milei, he's just like, I'm not sure about that guy. He's really dangerous and really crazy. And I wouldn't want to live in Argentina when he's in charge. That's for sure. Particularly if I was poor or in education or something like that, But I haven't been to Argentina. I'd like to go and have a look round, I think, see what he's doing over there.
Just in case there's a first-time listener here, I'm just going to emphasize what we're saying is the government is a source of its own spending money, but taxes are very, very important. Taxes start the whole MMT money model. The government needs to provision itself. It wants, roads, bridges, hospitals.
Sorry to barge in, but to clarify, the provisioning is not about money. It's about real stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So it wants this real stuff. And it needs to spend something. It could spend Bitcoin or gold or seashells, but you can't control the availability of those things. So, you should spend something that you can issue. And then how do you get people to value this thing that you issue? We call it a pound here in the UK. Well, you impose taxes in pounds so that people will always have a need for pounds. So taxes in our model drive the currency from inception. And then after that, you can incentivize behavior by giving tax breaks for things that you want to see more of and imposing higher taxes on things you want to see less of. So taxes are still important, just in case there's anybody out there thinking that we're not.
That we don't think taxes have any role. They do. They set a debt of the private sector, domestic private sector, to the government. And then they set the unit of account in which that debt is to be repaid.
Beautifully put. So I'm going to move on to number 3, which is government borrowing. And I'm going to put quote marks around borrowing. This is the idea that if the government can't fully fund itself with taxes, it has to borrow money from people and businesses, other institutions to fund itself. Then this makes the government dependent on these individuals and businesses, which is corrosive to democracy. Phil, what would you say to somebody who had the impression that the government bond issuance is about a government finding money from the private sector to fund itself?
Well, it goes back to that very first episode, I guess, that if you think the government's like a big household, then it gets money through taxes, and if it can't buy all the nurses and all the weapons it needs or whatever, it's going to have to borrow the rest from the private sector or foreigners or both. But if you understand how the system works, that the government always, not chooses to, always spends through just crediting accounts. It's got the legal power, and I'm Richard Tye's your expert, but from my memory, 1866, the government simply spends through order of Parliament. So it keys money in. It used to be, issuing notes or coins or whatever it might be. Now it just does it by data entry. And that goes into the system, and then taxes draw some out. Now, obviously, if you if you spend more than you tax, some money is left in the system. And if your listeners have read a bit of the reserve accounting, that'll be left in bank reserves. Now, all you're really doing is saying to the people who've got the reserves, in simple terms, the banks, do you want to have reserves which may pay interest or may not? And they used to not always pay interest. You offer them the option of a bond, which is a savings account. So really what's happening is the bond guys have got no control. You're just saying, look, you can keep your money in your current account, which is reserves, or you can buy a bond. We'll, if you like, borrow your money from you and put it in a savings account. Well, that's not an issue. And when it matures, it just goes back to the reserve. So it's like if you had money in your bank in a current account and you move it to a savings account, then when you decide to, you move it back into your current account. So there's no control over the interest rates or anything like that, and it's purely voluntary. Now, your listeners might think, well, why bother doing it then? Well, it's historic, because if you imagine, and I think we've probably mentioned before, under something like a gold standard, it was a slightly different affair, because if the government, say, spent 100 million and taxed back 80 million, there's 20 million now of convertible currency that could, in theory, be converted into gold. And the central bank might think, woo, we might lose 20 million of our gold reserves. We don't want that to happen. So they have to come up with some sort of deal. So they say to the guys who got the 20 million, we'll borrow back the money we've already spent, hence borrowing. And in exchange for it, we'll give you a thing called a bond or a savings account. And the people with the 20 million think, well, hang on a minute, that's not a very good deal unless you give me an interest rate. And therefore, that's why traditionally bonds paid interest. Technically, it was against the option to convert to gold. Nowadays, there is no option. So you don't have to give people who've got these reserves an interest rate. You might choose to for various reasons, but you don't have to. And so the whole idea that the government is in any way controlled by, bond vigilantes, which I think is an issue coming, it's a bit of a myth to me.
Yeah, I just wanted to just drill down into that idea of that the government is borrowing when it issues bonds. I think it's much more helpful, again, if you're kind of new to all of this, to think what's happened there is the buyer of the bond has chosen to move their pounds that were in a current account into a savings account at the central bank. It's much more demystifying to do it like that, rather than the government is taking something off the private sector which it wouldn't be able to get anywhere else, because that's what borrowing means to you and me in the private sector. I'm going to have to borrow this money and I'll pay it back to you later, and I'll have to give you interest because you don't have the money if I'm borrowing it off you, and you want compensating for that. And I think that's the problem with the characterizing that as borrowing. Like we say, the government is just offering a savings account to bondholders, really,
on money that it's already holding, right? It's already holding this money. It's just simply going to change it, as you say, from blue money to yellow money. Change the color of it.
Non-interest bearing pounds into interest bearing pounds.
Yeah, and even now reserves are interest paying.
Yeah,
so it's just about the difference. The level of interest that you're getting. So it's not borrowing because of that. It's already got the money, and it also creates the thing that
it creates the pounds. Yeah, and also the idea is that you've got the pounds that have been used to pay taxes or have been used to buy bonds must have come from the government in the first place. Otherwise, they're counterfeit.
Yeah. So I think some people get fixated on that because the government debt, some government debt, or what we colloquially call the government debt, is it's tradable and it pays interest, and that interest constitutes, well, the whole amount really constitutes a liability that the government has on the private sector, a liability of the government. But so do the reserves, really.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. In order for something to be credit to us, it has to be debt to some other counterparty. And as Phil has said in episodes gone by, it's back to that Mitchell-Innes view of the credit theory of money, that money is credit and nothing but. But, in order for it to be credit, it has to be a liability of a counterparty. And in this case, the money that we use, pounds, is a liability of the government, whether it's interest bearing in the form of a bond or whether it's the pounds that the £10 notes or the £50 notes that they spend into the economy.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in.
Before the Bank of England was made independent, in inverted commas, the issuance of tradable debt, like bonds, was only done with the purpose of the interest rate target, the Bank of England overnight target, so that the amount of bonds issued versus the size of the deficit, they didn't necessarily match, because they only issued as many bonds as they needed to hit the rate. And if the deficit was larger than that, then fine. It didn't make a difference. However, when I think as a result of joining the European Union and the rules were changed and Bank of England independence became a requirement of joining that. And then they added one step in between, whereby now, whenever the tradable debt, so bonds, are issued for the total side of the deficit, and then as an additional step, and then the Bank of England, either buys bonds or sells bonds in order to achieve the target. So it's an extra step which is completely unnecessary, and it's self-imposed. And it has absolutely nothing to do with funding the spending, because the spending has already been funded. It's a self-imposed rule. It's done to obscure how things actually happen and to try and limit the government capacities in a particular way, but they haven't really fundamentally changed.
There's an irony there, isn't there, that it's designed for, quote, I remember the word transparency, but actually makes it
less transparent.
Yes, the idea was that the government has to be seen to be doing things in a certain way. It's a long time ago for me to remember the phrases, but I remember one of them was transparency. So the argument is, governments like us, and when it spends, more than it taxes, it'll be clear by the bond issuance. It's been transparent where it's getting it from. But in reality, it just did what you said, Patricia. It sort of added more mystique to this mysterious sort of idea the government's like a household. So it was totally counterproductive
to the concept of transparency, right?
Yeah, the concept of transparency made things more opaque. And it's like, you get those letters sometimes. They've been out recently where they put your name at the top and they have a list of what you paid in tax and then a little figures about how much of your tax money has gone to various places in little colours, all to reinforce that the money you pay in tax has gone somewhere. And it was designed to make it clear to people why their taxes were important. And it was all coloured and everything. I remember getting one. But in reality, it just created even more of a veil over the whole process. And that's what there's unintended... well, maybe they are. I don't want to be a conspiracy about the government. I don't think they're that clever. But, whether they actually designed it that way...
It's probably just a happy accident. It seems to be working. It seems to be working politically. So why rock the boat? And then also, it's very hard to fight this very intuitive understanding of money that it must come from somewhere, but like nobody ever issues it, right? So like if we've our first experience of money is if we're lucky enough to have that kind of family, you get a pocket money and then eventually you kind of have to replace that pocket money with your own stream of income, which involves getting a job, and it's your whole experience of money is you're having to get it from another party somehow, but you never think about where it originates at any point. And then when somebody does come along and say, look, it does originate somewhere, it's not dug up from the ground or anything like that, people react very strongly to that. They're very certain of where money comes from all of a sudden. If you all these conversations, I don't know about you guys, conversations about economics that you have, people will be very sort of, I don't understand economics, and they're very sort of like, well, I'm not a macroeconomist, I'm sure there's some very brainy people out there who know what they're doing. And then as soon as you start talking about the origins of money, they're very certain that, it's got something to do with barter, or everybody's got a very deeply rooted money story. But the bond thing, I'll link to that Richard Tye episode that you referenced earlier, Phil, and our episodes, our sort of foundational episodes on understanding bonds and the terminology around that in the show notes. But a subset of this bond story is the bond vigilantes. So that's going to be our nominee number 4 for the stinkiest talking point out there. Bond vigilantes, the idea that it's not voters who mistakenly think they're giving leaders a mandate to implement policies when they vote, but rather it's bond traders, this tiny sliver of humanity, bond traders who are in charge of what's politically possible in the UK. What would you say to that idea, Phil?
It's quite interesting because some time ago I talked to a senior official at the Bank of England, and he was quite clear that the way the Bank of England currently operates is it's a balance, for want of a better phrase, between what the Bank of England does and what the markets do. So they've decided that instead of determining the interest rate, because it's the issuer, they're going to set the overnight rate, which they do, and everybody knows it comes on the TV, move it up and down, and let the long-term rate be determined by bond traders. So like as Patricia was saying, so say you spend 100 million as they use in the other maths, tax back 80, you've got 20 left. Then the bond traders can bid prices for bonds which equate to an interest rate. Now, that means what you're doing is you're giving them the choice to determine the long-term rate, rather than saying to them, this is what the rate is, which you could do. So you then say, well, why do you want to give them the option then? Well, why not just tell them that's what you're getting? And the reason is, it's because in the mandate, it's the assumption that these guys know what the rate should be. That the Bank of England doesn't really know what the rate should be, so let them do it. So it's the idea is we'll put the peg in the ground, the short-term rate, and then we'll let the traders decide on the long-term rate by their bids, and that's a choice. And when pressed, the official did admit that is a choice, and they could set the long rate. And then the next question really follows from that is, well, what do the traders, how do they determine their bonds? Well, bond bids, i.e. what do they want the interest rate to be? Well, the only information they really care about is what they think the short-term rate is going to be. So if they think, well, okay, we think there's going to be a lot of inflation, the bond traders will think, there's going to be a lot of inflation, we think there will be, then that means that the Bank of England will put the short-term rate up. So that means we don't really want to be stuck paying, getting very little interest for long term. So they'll bid less for bonds. So the so-called yield curve will drop across the whole spectrum. So the long-term rate will fall based on that expectation. And so that's all that's really happening. You're letting the markets decide, but all they're doing is doing what they think your short-term rate's going to be to make the decision. And if that hasn't given you a headache, you can then imagine, the old Liz Truss thing. So Liz Truss comes in. She didn't, not to be cheeky, she didn't look terribly competent, nor did Bobby Quarten, not to be too cheeky. So the dealers would be thinking, whoa, that doesn't look like a very good policy idea, tax cuts and all this stuff. So that might be inflationary. So they all think, oh, well, when we bid for bonds, then we'll bid lower, and that'll drive the interest rate up and the bond price is going down. And then, of course, at that point, without going into that crisis of the LDI or whatever, the value of bonds has now gone down. Now, at that point, you could say, wasn't Liz Truss rather careless in not making sure the Bank of England was right on board with what she was up to? I'll leave your listeners to decide. Or why didn't the Bank of England immediately buy a load of bonds to bring the prices back up and avoid the crisis? So it's not like the bond vigilantes were in charge. It was just they were doing what they normally do. They were thinking, okay, Liz Truss doesn't know what she's doing. There's going to be inflation. Interest rates are going to go up. We'll bid accordingly.
As you said before, the bond vigilantes, in inverted commas, they were trying to second guess what the Bank of England was going to think. So the bond traders were thinking, will the Bank of England find this inflationary and therefore raise the rate? and it's all very circular. But
I think it's worth noting that what you just said, Phil, Truss or Kwarteng, or both of them, should have maybe had a conversation with the Bank of England and told them what they were planning to do, and because eventually the BOE did end that crisis by doing exactly what you just said in passing, Phil, which was, they stepped in with a bond buying package to get the price where they considered the price should be of the 5-year and the 10-year gilt, and they could do that because they have infinity pounds. They can just keep buying them or selling them into the market, until the price that they want to see is there. And that's what Japan have been doing for a very long time now. So it's not like it's exotic to us here in the UK, and it's certainly not been exotic in other countries, other advanced economies.
Yeah, it's just a choice. If you think that bond dealers should have the right to set the long-term rate, because quote unquote they know what they're doing, or they're very good at guessing what you might do without going round back to the other argument.
Not judging the beauty contest, but judging what the judges will judge.
Yeah.
Yes, that's kind of it. We could really go on, but like in a wartime or something, you just set the rate, because it's like the old crisis argument. You wouldn't let bond traders set the interest rate in wartime, because they're basically determining what rewards they can get. I mean, it's slightly more complex than that. You wouldn't do that. You want to keep the rate as low as possible. And so I'm not an expert in the history of the bond systems and the auction systems, but it's all about a choice. And if you imagine that we talk about this phrase neoliberalism, once we move into the later years, there's this idea that the government doesn't know what it's doing, but markets do. And therefore, where we can, we're going to cede power to markets. And because we think they know what they're doing. But then it goes on for a long time and people forget that they give the power away. And they suddenly think that the people they gave the power to actually have it anyway. And this is quite some psychological issue. I honestly don't know what it is. They just forget. It's like they forgot about COVID now, when the government, spent money into existence, which was required at the time. Now they've gone back to 2010, with austerity. We can't afford it. We're all in it together when we're not. Apart from if you're rich and we won't tax you because you'll leave the country or something like that. So it's incredibly strange behaviour in some ways, but there we are.
Speaking of the battle of memory over forgetting, in that Liz Truss debacle, it's very hard not to say the word debacle after Liz Truss, but people will probably remember, and are probably still living with the legacy of it, that when those bond prices dipped and yields move up, the prices and yields move in opposite directions. But anyway, the price of long-term government bonds, 5-year, 10-year and beyond, went down. and mortgage rates shot up, and people will remember that, and people got hurt by that. Why did that happen? How is it transmitted from the bond market to the person on the street with a mortgage?
Well, it's a question if you've got the cost of funds goes up, if you put the interest rate up, then if you're making loans, then from the point of view of banks, although they don't lend out reserves, they will have a source, won't they, of reserves if they haven't got enough when they make the transfer. Plus the fact if you got a trust-like budget, which the dealers think is going to lead to inflation and mean that long-term rates are going to go up, you will imagine now if you're making a loan as a bank or a building society, you're imagining at that point a higher interest rate environment to come because of the expectations in the system. So they're all like triggering each other. And the only way to really deal with that is, in my opinion, of course, is to forget about this whole market stuff. Going to an MMT, I just set the risk-free rate permanently at zero. Take this whole bond thing out. So in which case, going back to the mortgages, all that would really happen is building societies, banks wouldn't be looking at, well, what do we think the long-term rate's going to be, and we're going to set mortgages at a higher rate because of the expectations of inflation and all this other stuff, like little rows of things. Just be a risk premium. So in other words, people could buy houses based on a risk premium. Can you repay? And that's sensible credit management.
By long-term rate, I think I might write, if I can rephrase what you've said, and you tell me if I'm getting it wrong, Phil, is this idea that the expectation is that the Bank of England will, in the future, raise rates in order to address the inflation that Liz Truss's budget is expected to cause.
Yes.
So what we mean by the long-term rates is the long-term prospects for the interest rate.
Yes, and they will be, so the long-term prospect rates, yes, drive up the current long-term rate. So it's kind of both, but you're absolutely right. Yes.
And I keep thinking, what could have Liz Truss done? Because I think it's quite important for potentially a progressive government, understanding the dynamics of what happened, because these are issues that they may themselves face once in government. So one of the things that I keep thinking is, well, what should have Liz Truss done, really? But the more and more I think about it, the more I think that had Liz Truss was looking weak from the onset, as Phil put it very kindly. She didn't look very competent. I don't think very many people in her party thought that she was very competent.
And maybe the way she wanted to assert dominance is moving very aggressively, very quickly, thinking, well, that's the way people assert.
That's the way people, assertive people do it, right? So, but I guess what she didn't know was that she actually, to be that assertive, you need to start off with a lot of backing. And I think that if she, for example, if she had just won the election and had a big mandate, and there was clear popular support for her policies, and people within her party, were very likely to back her either because of popular support or because they were just, they really liked her as a leader, then I don't think the Bank of England would have had much choice but simply to just carry on supporting the rate or doing what it needed to do. Because, of course, then the Bank of England is at risk of being put in its place, right? And I don't think Andrew Bailey would have been taking that risk had he seen that Liz Truss had the backing of her party in government and a strong majority.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to move on to numbers 5 and 6, and I'm going to do them together because they kind of go together. 5 is this term that I personally don't like, UK PLC. And it gets used all the time by politicians and pundits. And it's the idea that the government isn't exactly like a household. It's more like a business that needs to turn a profit
Yeah, so it doesn't need to balance its budget, right? It needs to have more of an income than it has outgoings.
So it's kind of progress from the government as a household analogy, but it's still there. It's like we've got to turn a profit or we'll be outcompeted, and that will make us insolvent as a nation. And then that leads to number 6 of the stinky talking points, which is that economic growth, therefore, is the only route to fixing the economy, filling fiscal black holes. What would you say to somebody holding those views, Patricia?
I think those two are related, like you say. It's this kind of view that, well, government invests, right? They don't like saying government spends because it sounds wasteful. They say invests, but then they make the parallel of the UK as a business, so that it has to invest. But then we fall into this trap of thinking that the only valid kind of government use of government funds is only that which generates growth, or invests in order to have a bigger GDP in future, right? So it kind of puts the government operating as a business in a pedestal, and at the same time it tends to undervalue things that are currently not considered investment, but are very important for people's well-being. So, like things like social care, paying nurses a good salary, or for example, education. Money spent on teachers, on more teachers, is not considered investment, and yet I would arguably say that it's a huge investment into the country's future.
And all kinds of things that get characterized as feminist economists would have it, things get characterized as women's work, all that domestic labor and stuff like that. And the actual sort of, reproduction of the workforce, the source of that labor being the source of value, all of that, none of that's valued because when people talk about economic growth, they talk about GDP. And obviously there's a situation in GDP where if you don't own your house, if you own your house, so you're not paying rent, what they do when they're calculating GDP is they work it out as if you were renting your house from yourself. So your house, therefore, is being credited with doing something valuable, generating an income. And is afforded a place in the GDP statistic, whereas, like we say, all this stuff that is completely not counted and that is often characterized or coded as women's work or feminine. And it starts with the domestic labor and it goes into like the care work, which is actually marketable stuff, and it does actually, it's the underpinning of the whole economy.
So apparently having children is an indulgence,
it's a lifestyle choice.
It's a lifestyle choice that doesn't affect anybody else other than the people making that choice, and not the souls of future workers in order to sustain the existing population. It's bizarre, the kind of things that we class as investment versus the things that we class as consumption. I'd say there's very little that is not investment, other than maybe
Bitcoin.
AI. People are going to have a go at me, but things like Bitcoin, or just actively wasteful stuff. And
it's kind of something else that you've talked about in the past as well, Patricia, which I like as well. It pops up in my head a lot of the time. These kind of narratives like taxpayer money, like the money's got to come from taxpayers, therefore people who pay more tax are more important and are more responsible for making the country work. And also this idea that the UK is a business kind of makes, and this is how you put it a lot of the time, Patricia, I really like it, it makes the good dependent on the bad. So we need a carbon tax. We need people to pollute and put carbon in the atmosphere to generate a carbon tax to pay for the government to clean it up out of the atmosphere, that kind of thing.
Yeah. First, we need to pollute to make enough money to clean the pollution. It's just wrong. And again, it's this excessive focus on money as being kind of the scarce commodity versus actually our environment and people and real things being what is precious and that we should be taking good care of. I hate that analogy. I'm gonna I'm going to propose that should be the winner.
Yeah, you can always tell somebody's politics when they start saying UK PLC. But
yeah.
I imagine, Phil, this has some bearing on something that you'll be teaching next term as well, or in February this year when you're working for Modern Money Lab. You're teaching the inequality module, right?
Yeah, I think it's more June. Yeah, just standing in for Dirk, who's working in Brussels. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. You know, Dirk's very kindly done some brilliant videos and materials. So, yeah, that should be really good. Yes, I mean, the inequality and the way that, you know, distributional questions. Apparently, the students are very good, I've heard.
Right, yeah. From the students themselves, namely me, right?
I was reading John T. Harvey's book on the contending perspectives, you know, and he had this phrase, I don't know whether he developed himself, it's very good, there's no views without a viewpoint. So we all approach things from particular, and it's inevitable, good or bad, it is what it is. And we've got this thing that, and it's a very pervasive idea, that the things that government do aren't that important, and we can only do them because the private sector has already created the wealth, whatever that means, to allow the government to do it. So Keir Starmer was saying you can't have a good health service without already having a powerful economy, i.e. the private sector generates the real wealth resources, then we can afford the health service. Whereas obviously from our viewpoint of view, it's the reverse. And that's the issue here with this investment thing, that firms invest and they're great and they do all. And then if the firms are doing really well, then we can have a few government things. So we've got to kind of, the Liz Truss, unleash the power of private capital. And only if that works first, then we can have the things we want. Whereas the reality, of course, like many of these, is the reverse, that it's the government's provision of healthcare, education, infrastructure, stable, that allows the private sector to flourish.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.